Such a bank could evaluate prospective projects on consistent terms, encourage states to work together, and create an avenue for private investors to put risk capital into new projects. In short, it would treat infrastructure like a long-term investment rather than an expense. Importantly, it also would remove individual projects from the vagaries of the annual appropriations process. This is a very strong idea and one I hope that the Congress will approve in short order. But in addition to a national infrastructure bank, the President also has proposed fully funding the nation's green infrastructure bank, the Land and Water Conservation Fund. Established in 1964 and capitalized entirely by offshore oil and gas receipts, the concept being that resource depletion would pay for resource conservation. It is the primary vehicle that the federal government, as well as states and local jurisdictions, uses to finance investments in national parks and refuges, easements on working farms, forests and ranches, urban parks, greenways. Green infrastructure is no less an investment in our future than our roads, bridges, and railways, and the Land and Water Conservation Fund, as the nation's green infrastructure bank, needs full and permanent funding. Over $10 billion for projects of these kinds have been appropriated over the last 40 years at the federal level, and more than $4 billion in matching grants to state and localities for similar projects. A huge investment in our nation's green infrastructure that is at risk today in the deliberations of the Congress. The good news is that the public overwhelmingly supports these kinds of investments. Why? Because these investments generate significant economic output, provide millions of jobs, and improve quality of life in communities all across the country. There was a recent national poll that showed that 64% of Americans are concerned about our nation's infrastructure and want more money spent on it. 64% want more money spent on infrastructure. An even higher amount, 66%, said that improving the country's transportation infrastructure is highly important. In addition, the public understands the economic benefits of infrastructure improvement. 80% of voters agree that federal funding to improve and modernize transportation infrastructure will boost local economies and create millions of jobs. And this strong support is mirrored in efforts to invest specifically in green infrastructure. In the elections of last fall, 75% of all conservation ballot measures that were proposed passed. 75%. A record of success that is consistent with each of the last 5 election cycles. Over the past 10 years, Americans have voted to tax themselves more than $35 billion to invest in green infrastructure, to protect the lands and waters that they love and the quality of life in the communities where they live, work, and play. You see, voters have learned that these measures often provide cost-effective local solutions to clean air and clean water and provide the foundation for new sustainable economies. For example, just recently, New York City was allowed to continue its program to protect its watershed in the Catskills and Hudson River Valley from development. This announcement was just made by the city and the state, and under this program, which began back in 1997, the city has spent more than $400 million to protect about 160,000 acres, with another $140 million in reserve for future purchases, thereby enabling the city to avoid having to filter its drinking water, saving at least $10 billion that they would otherwise have had to spend on a filtration plant. Similarly, across the country in California, Northern California and Mendocino County, our organization, the Conservation Fund, has now acquired over 40,000 acres of redwood forest, borrowing money from the State Water Control Board because we sold them the idea that having us manage the forest and remove the road system from the stream beds would serve as an upstream water treatment plant, which they agreed for the first time in the United States history. And we are now managing those lands not just for salmon restoration and water quality, but we have also implemented the largest carbon offset program in the country, certified carbon offsets, selling over $15 million of credits in the last 2 years. And later in this program, you'll hear success stories from places all around the country, including Milwaukee, Wisconsin, led by Kevin Schaefer, and from Nashville, Tennessee, led by Mayor Carl Dean, two of the more exciting leaders in the green infrastructure movement in this country. These efforts demonstrate green infrastructure in action. Natural areas are not simply lands that have yet to be developed. Parks are not simply beautiful places. Working lands are not merely sites for producing food and fiber. These open spaces are part of the critical infrastructure of the country. Climate change, water quality, air quality, recreation, and we need to make sure that they stay this way. The loss of open space remains a particularly difficult issue as it relates to green infrastructure. Americans everywhere now recognize that the accelerated consumption of land and its associated ecological and social consequences are a leading land use issue. As far back as 1958, William White wrote, "Sprawl is bad aesthetics. It is bad economics. 5 acres is made to do the work of 1 and do it very poorly. This is bad for farmers, it is bad for communities, it is bad for industry, and it is even bad for the developers." A recent poll by the Pew Center for Civic Journalism showed that when Americans were asked to name the most important problem facing the community where they live, 18% of respondents across the country cite sprawl as their top concern, the same percentage as those citing crime. In suburban communities, sprawl, outrage, crime, and other problems, over 26% said it was their community's most pressing problem. And as the economy recovers, this will only intensify because America continues to grow. Each year we add more than 2.5 million people, and with the population in the U.S. expected to double to 600 million, these challenges will not subside. How we plan for this growth and how we incorporate nature, open space, green infrastructure into our communities is of paramount importance. Green infrastructure provides us the path forward with new ideas and a new language for framing our efforts. Listen to how Peter Kilborn, a writer for the New York Times, spoke of America's highways back in 2001. The 47,000-mile network of limited access roads that make up the interstate system is a linear economy on wheels, a distinct and self-sustaining 51st state, in a sense, that generates life and commerce. We could learn to describe our projects in such a way and benefit from it. A distinct and self-sustaining state, generating life and commerce, infrastructure almost as a living, breathing thing. But what about our nation's forests? Our forests provide 83% of the drinking water and support in this country and support more than 1 million jobs that cannot be exported overseas. Yet through lack of investing, we continue to lose more than 1.5 million acres of forest land each year. If we're not careful, we'll find ourselves in a situation similar to that of the great city of Atlanta, which is the fastest growing human settlement on the planet. Atlanta spent the past 5 decades paving over most of its forests, where its drinking water comes from, and now has very little groundwater recharge. Atlanta could have acquired most of these lands for less than $1,000 an acre over the years. And yet now there are plans underway to tear down older developments and reforest them at a cost of more than $500,000 an acre. Destroying our nation's green infrastructure in the name of economic development is bad policy, bad economics, and bad planning. It is the ultimate disinvestment in America. What we need is a new conversation about investing in our future. As taxpayers, certainly we understand why our nation's built infrastructure is publicly financed. It spreads the cost of development and upkeep across a large pool of users. It ensures that all parts are connected to one another to achieve some greater design function, and of course it meets our public need. When it comes to air and water quality, flood control, carbon sequestration, it is time we recognize our wetlands and forests, our green infrastructure, as appropriate and necessary recipients of public funds. That is the conversation that we're having right now in Congress, and you need to weigh in. Think about it. The outdoor recreation industry alone now tops $730 billion in economic output, supporting more than 6.5 million jobs. But you can't have an active outdoor recreation industry without the green infrastructure to support it. This is a message we need to deliver in Congress and state houses all across the country, in our churches, our schools, our living rooms. It is a message of hope and optimism, and one that says we are serious about remaining a great nation. And it is a message that we need to have with our young people, for they too are part of the critical infrastructure of our country. And it is our job to make sure they are prepared to inherit and be good stewards of the nation's magnificent natural legacy. And that's what I'd like to speak with you about for just a moment. You see, over the past 30 years, children of the digital age have become increasingly alienated from the natural world, with disturbing implications not only for their physical fitness, but also for their long-term mental and spiritual health, and of course, for the environment. Young people who grow up without spending time in nature are much less likely to be strong champions of the environment when they reach voting age. 20 or 30 years from now, we will have people who are in leadership positions in our public, private, and nonprofit institutions who will be asked to make very tough policy and budget decisions about wetlands and forests and natural areas, having never seen a wetland or walked in a forest or been in a natural area. They have never gotten their hands dirty in a garden. This is an untenable situation. While opening up a wealth of virtual experiences to the young, all of the new technologies that we have today have made it easier and easier for children to spend less time outside. The average child now spends less than 4 minutes a day outside. Wall Street, of course, calls this progress. But if that's true, then the writer Ogden Nash was right when he said, progress may have been a good thing at one time, but it went on a little too long. We need to seek a little more balance to move toward what entrepreneur and economist Paul Hawken calls a developing economy rather than focusing solely on growth. A growing economy, he says, is getting bigger. A developing economy is getting better. Put another way, the market has its place, but the market needs to be kept in its place. Recently, I passed a giant billboard from IKEA. You know the furniture store IKEA. I passed this giant billboard that read, "Kids, go play inside." Now, what does it say about our priorities as a society when we choose to market clever furniture in place of clever kids? When we will drive miles out of our way to buy free-range chicken, but are too busy or too scared to encourage free-range children. There is a dullness in our young people today because they have lost the spark that comes from interacting with the world around them. It is time that we reclaim the higher ground. But how do we get there from here? Martin Luther King said that the success of any social movement depends on its ability to show a world where people will want to go. To show a world where people will want to go. But where is that? Now, you and I may want to go to the Okefenokee National Wildlife Refuge or the canyons of Zion National Park. But for a child in East Philadelphia, East St. Louis, or East LA, it may be someplace entirely different. In fact, it may be the abandoned lot next door.